The facility smelled like lavender and quiet money. Everything was soft. Soft lighting, soft music drifting through the corridors, soft voices that never rose above a murmur. Evergreen Pines Memory Care and Rehabilitation was the kind of place that cost $12,000 a month and made you feel guilty for noticing the price. In the center of it all sat a man who hadn't spoken in 11 days. His name was Elliot Crane, 41 years old, founder and CEO of Crane Systems, one of the fastest-growing infrastructure software companies in the Pacific Northwest. A man who had once delivered keynotes to rooms of 1,000 people now sat in a cushioned chair by a window, staring at a garden he never asked to see. What the staff didn't know, what no one knew, was that Elliot Crane was not confused. He was listening. It had started 3 weeks ago, before the facility, before the paperwork, before his son-in-law's hand on his shoulder and the words, "Dad, we think you need rest." It had started with a board meeting he wasn't supposed to know about, a conversation he'd overheard between his daughter Vanessa and her husband, Stuart Price, in the hallway outside his corner office at Crane Systems headquarters. "The competency evaluation gives us the leverage," Stuart had said. His voice was the kind of calm that only comes from rehearsal. Once the board sees the filing, they'll move to suspend his executive authority. Temporary, they'll call it, but temporary has a way of becoming permanent. Elliot had stood frozen just outside the doorframe, the coffee in his hand going cold. "And the shares?" Vanessa had asked. "Transferred to a family trust, managed by me legally until he's declared fit to resume, which won't happen if we control who evaluates him." There had been a pause, then Vanessa's voice quieter. "He's not actually sick, Stuart." "No," Stuart said, "but he will be on paper." Elliot had walked back to his office, sat down at his desk, and stared at the wall for a long time. His first instinct was to call his attorney, a man named Bergman, who had helped build Crane Systems from a 2-person LLC into a publicly traded company. But then he stopped himself. If he moved too fast, they would move faster. He needed more than suspicion. He needed proof. So when Vanessa came to him 2 days later, with pamphlets and gentle eyes and the word burnout, Elliot Crane did something that went against every instinct he had ever developed in 20 years of business. He agreed. He let them bring him here. He let the intake coordinator document his episodes of confusion and social withdrawal. He swallowed whatever they gave him at night and spit it out when the nurse turned away, and he waited. The window in his room faced east. Every morning, the sun came in at an angle that turned the dust motes gold. Elliot watched them drift and thought about the evidence he needed, the names he could trust, and the people who were already deciding his life without him in the room. He had been here 9 days when Faye Calloway walked in for the first time. She introduced herself simply, "I'm Faye. I'm a social worker with the county. I've been assigned to complete your functional assessment." She was younger than he expected, early 30s, maybe, with a calm that didn't read as indifference. She carried a battered canvas tote instead of a briefcase. Her notepad had a coffee ring on the cover. She sat across from him and said, "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. I'm just going to observe today." Most of the staff spoke to him the way people speak to someone who is almost certainly not listening. Faye spoke to him the way people speak when they aren't sure, and they're choosing to err on the side of respect. Elliot stared out the window and said nothing. But he noticed everything about her. The way she wrote in her notepad not just what he did but what he didn't do, and what the room felt like. The way she paused at the medication log on his door and ran her finger down the list. The small crease between her brows when she got to the sedative dosage. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 4th visit she brought 2 coffees, set one on the table near his hand without a word. He didn't touch it, but the gesture meant something, and she didn't need him to acknowledge it. On the 6th visit she spoke while writing her notes, not to him exactly, more like thinking out loud. "I requested your previous medical records," she said, "from your personal physician, Dr. Abrams. The facility cited a processing delay. That's the 3rd time I've been told that." She wrote something down. "Your nutritional intake log hasn't been co-signed by a physician in 8 days. That's not standard protocol." She turned a page, and the recreational therapy referral that was supposed to happen on day 3 still hasn't been scheduled. She looked up at him then. Her eyes were direct without being aggressive. "I don't know what's happening in this room," she said quietly enough that no one in the hallway could have heard. "But I've worked in enough facilities to know when a file has been managed, and yours has been managed." Elliot's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. Faye saw it. She didn't react. She wrote something in her notepad and closed it. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. Same time. That night, lying in the too-soft bed with the lavender smell seeping under the door, Elliot stared at the ceiling and felt something he hadn't felt since he'd walked through the facility's front entrance. Not hope, exactly. More like the recognition that someone else could see the shape of the thing. Faye Calloway came back. She always came back. And slowly, carefully, Elliot began to test the boundary between what he had decided to hide and what he could no longer afford to. It started small. He turned his head when she entered instead of keeping his gaze fixed on the window. Then one morning he reached for the coffee she left. He didn't drink it, but he wrapped his hand around the cup. Faye noticed. She didn't smile or make a sound. She just wrote in her notepad and kept talking in that quiet, thinking-out-loud way of hers. "The facility's admitting physician, Dr. Wendell Cross, has a consulting contract with a private equity firm that recently expressed interest in acquiring Crane Systems," she said one morning, her voice completely level. "I found that in a public disclosure. It took me 20 minutes. She paused. "I don't think that's a coincidence." Elliot's hand tightened around the coffee cup. "I don't think you're confused," she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the window. "I think you're choosing not to speak, and I think you have a reason." She finally turned to him. "I'm not going to push you, but I want you to know that whatever I find, I'm going to write it honestly. That's the only way I know how to do my job." The next morning when Faye arrived, she found Elliot sitting differently. Not hunched against the window but upright, hands folded on his knees, she set her tote down, opened her notepad. And Elliot Crane said his first words in 11 days. "The firm is called Meridian Capital." His voice was rough from disuse. "They've been circling the company for 18 months. My son-in-law Stuart Price has been in contact with their managing partner since last spring. I have emails. Not here, but I know where they are." Faye's pen stopped moving. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the notepad down on the table, face up, and folded her hands over it. "Tell me everything," she said. He did, not all at once. Over the next 3 days, in careful pieces, Elliot laid out what he knew and what he suspected. The board meeting, the conversation in the hallway, the way his personal calendar had been quietly rerouted through Vanessa's assistant in the months before his breakdown. The fact that Bergman, his attorney, had been excluded from the last 2 rounds of correspondence about the competency filing. Faye listened. She asked precise questions. She never once looked alarmed, which was its own kind of steadiness. On the evening of the 3rd day, she sat back in her chair and looked at him the way someone looks when they're deciding something. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I almost didn't take this case. My supervisor offered it to me as a favor, last-minute reassignment. The original worker had a family emergency. I almost said no because the caseload was already full." She paused. "I'm glad I didn't." Elliot looked at her. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you should know that I'm here by accident," she said, "and I'm staying on purpose." That night she left the facility and drove to a 24-hour copy shop 3 towns over. She printed every document she'd photographed on her phone over the past 2 weeks, the medication logs, the unsigned physician notes, the admitting physician's public consulting disclosures. She organized them into a folder, made 3 copies, and locked one in her car, one in her apartment, and kept one in her bag. Then she sat in the parking lot for a while, engine running, and thought about what it would cost her if she was wrong. She thought about her old supervisor at the county office who had told her, your first year in, that the system doesn't always protect people who push. She thought about the 2 colleagues she'd watched get reassigned into obscurity after filing complaints against private care operators. She thought about the way Stuart Price had looked at her during a facility check-in, that particular brand of smile that meant he was calculating. Then she thought about Elliot Crane sitting by that window for 11 days, not because his mind had failed him, but because the people around him had decided it was more convenient if it had. She put the car in drive and went home. The next morning, she arrived earlier than usual. Elliot was already awake, sitting at the small desk in the corner, which he had never used before. He looked up when she came in. "I need you to find someone," he said. "His name is Bergman, Howard Bergman. He's been my attorney for 16 years. They cut him out of the filing process, but he doesn't know the full picture. If anyone can move fast and quietly, it's him." Faye pulled out her phone and opened a notes app. "Spell the last name." He did. "I'll find him today," she said. "Faye." He said her name for the first time. She paused. "They'll try to remove you from the case when this starts moving. They'll say conflict of interest, or procedural irregularity, or something that sounds bureaucratic and isn't." She met his eyes. "I know." "Are you prepared for that?" She thought about it honestly, the way he seemed to appreciate. "No," she said, "but I'm doing it anyway." She found Howard Bergman through a bar association directory and a single phone call to his office. He called back within the hour. She met him in a diner off Route 9 that afternoon, a corner booth, 2 coffees going cold between them, while she walked him through everything she had documented. Howard Bergman was 63 years old, had the kind of face that had seen a great deal, and had the particular stillness of a man who did not scare easily. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked down at the folder she had pushed across the table and was quiet for a moment. "How is he?" he finally asked. "Not legally, personally." "Sharper than most people I've evaluated," Faye said, "and more patient than anyone I've ever met." Bergman nodded. He picked up his coffee. "Give me 48 hours." He used 36. On a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after Faye Calloway had first walked into room 14 with a coffee-stained notepad, Howard Bergman filed an emergency motion to halt the competency proceeding and reinstate Elliot Crane's full legal authority, citing improper conflict of interest in the admitting physician, absence of a court-appointed independent evaluator as required by state code, and documentation of a coordinated pattern of medical neglect. He also sent a copy of Faye's documentation packet to the State Health Department's Compliance Division and to a reporter at the Pacific Business Journal who had been, as it happened, investigating Meridian Capital for an unrelated but adjacent story for the past 4 months. Elliot heard none of this in real time. He was in his room when it happened, doing the slow work of reclaiming the range of motion in his shoulders, which had stiffened from weeks of deliberate stillness. Faye came to tell him at noon. She closed the door behind her, which she didn't always do. "Bergman filed this morning," she said. "The court issued a stay on the competency proceeding. They've also flagged the facility for a compliance inspection." She sat down. "Stewart was notified about 2 hours ago." Elliot was quiet for a moment. "And Vanessa?" Faye held his gaze. She was with him when he got the call. He looked out the window. The garden was bright in the November sun, frost on the grass, leaves mostly gone. He had watched that garden for weeks without really seeing it. Now it looked different. Just a garden. Just cold light on dead grass. She knew, he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know how much," Faye said carefully. "That'll come out." He nodded slowly. "It always does." 3 days later, Elliot Crane walked out of Evergreen Pines under his own authority, dressed in clothes Bergman had brought, carrying nothing else. He paused at the facility entrance and turned back once to look at the building. Then he got into Bergman's car and didn't look again. He was in his own office by that afternoon, behind his own desk, with Bergman across from him and a stack of documents that needed his signature. The building felt the same and entirely different. His assistant, a quietly efficient man named Theo, who had worked for him for 6 years, set a coffee on the desk without being asked and left without a word. Elliot looked around his office, the view, the city grid, the screen still dark, and felt the exact weight of everything he had almost lost. The board met 2 weeks later. Stewart Price did not attend. He had resigned 4 days prior, cited personal reasons in his letter, and retained a criminal defense attorney the following morning. Meridian Capital quietly withdrew their acquisition interest. Vanessa had not called. Elliot had not called either, not yet. There was a version of this that could still be repaired, someday carefully if she chose it. He wasn't ready to know yet which version was real. The board meeting was brief, factual, and largely procedural. His authority was fully reinstated. Dr. Cross's consulting arrangement was terminated. A formal review of the facility's practices was underway. The numbers on the screen were good. Crane Systems had not broken stride. Afterward, one of the board members, an older woman named Patricia Dole, who had known Elliot for a decade, stopped him in the hallway. "You should have called me," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't sure who I could trust." She nodded slowly. "And now?" He thought about that. "I'm working on it." He drove himself to the diner off Route 9 that evening. Faye was already there, same corner booth, same 2 coffees. She was reading something on her phone when he walked in, and she looked up without surprise. "How did it go?" she asked. He sat across from her. "Bergman says it'll take another 6 months to fully untangle the corporate paperwork. The state's compliance report on the facility could take longer." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "But the company is intact." She nodded. "I'm starting a foundation," he said. "I've been thinking about it for the last 2 weeks." He looked at her. "There are people sitting in facilities like that one right now who don't have a Bergman, who don't have anyone who notices that the physician's notes haven't been co-signed." He paused. "I want to fund independent social work oversight for private care placements, patient advocates who can't be removed by family members or facility administrators." He held her gaze. "I'd like you to help design it." Faye was quiet for a moment. Outside, traffic moved past the window in the early dark. "I'm a county social worker," she said. "You were," he said. "I spoke to your director this afternoon. The county has agreed to second you to the foundation for a 2-year term if you want it." She looked at him. "I should have asked you first," he said. "Yes," she said, "you should have." A beat passed. "Do you want it?" he asked. She looked down at her coffee, then out the window, then back at him. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. Something in his chest, some last-held tension, let go. They sat in that booth for another 2 hours. She told him about her first year as a social worker, a patient she hadn't been able to help, a family that had closed ranks, a file she still thought about. He told her about the early years of building Crane Systems, sleeping on a couch in the first office, the specific terror of the first time payroll was due, and the accounts were short by $11,000. They talked like people who had been through something together, and were only now getting to actually meet each other. When she stood to leave, she pulled on her coat and looped her scarf once around her neck, and he stood too, and for a moment they were just 2 people in a diner, lit by the particular warmth of a place that doesn't ask anything of you. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the foundation, not for the documentation or the calls or the 48-hour drive to a copy shop 3 towns over. For all of it and for none of it specifically." She seemed to understand. "You would have found a way out," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but not like this." She nodded once. Then she walked out into the November night, and through the window he watched her pull her coat tighter against the cold and disappear around the corner. He left a few minutes later. In the year that followed, the Crane Foundation for Patient Advocacy placed independent oversight workers in 37 private care facilities across 4 states. 2 of those placements resulted in state investigations. One led to criminal charges against a facility administrator. Faye Calloway became the foundation's director of field operations. She hired carefully, trained rigorously, and had a particular talent for walking into a room and immediately sensing what was being hidden and what was being ignored. She kept the coffee-stained notepad on her desk as a kind of joke she never explained to anyone. Elliot Crane returned to running Crane Systems with the specific attention of someone who had been reminded that everything could be taken away. He was a harder negotiator than he used to be, and a more patient listener. He cleared his schedule every Wednesday and spent the morning at the Foundation's office, where he had a standing coffee with Faye, and they went through the field reports together. It was not a dramatic romance. It grew the way things grow when 2 people keep choosing the same room. One afternoon in early spring, after a long morning of case reviews and a difficult phone call, with a facility that was pushing back on an oversight placement, Faye put her head down on her folded arms at the conference table and said, in a muffled voice, "I need 5 minutes." Elliot, sitting at the other end of the table, said nothing. He refilled her coffee, set it back near her hand, and kept reading the report in front of him. She lifted her head after a while, looked at the coffee, then at him. "You know," she said, "I really didn't expect any of this." "Neither did I," he said, without looking up. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that doesn't need an audience. He looked up then. The afternoon light was coming through the conference room window at an angle that turned everything slightly gold. Outside, the city moved the way cities move. Indifferent, continuous, entirely unaware of whatever is happening in any particular room. Inside, two people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances sat at a table covered in files and cold coffee, in the ordinary clutter of work that mattered, and said nothing else for a while. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be completely true. And some people find their way to each other not through grand gestures or perfect timing, but through the accumulated weight of showing up, of noticing what others have decided not to see, of staying when it would have been so much easier to walk away. Elliot Crane had spent 20 years building something he could point to. It had taken 11 days in a room that smelled of lavender to learn what was actually worth protecting. And Faye Calloway, who had almost said no, who had taken the case as a favor, who had driven to a copy shop at midnight because she couldn't think of what else to do, she had walked into that room with a coffee-stained notepad and no idea that she was about to change everything. That's the thing about the people who save you. They rarely know they're doing it. They're just doing what they believe is right, one quiet choice at a time, in rooms where no one is watching. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, that's exactly enough. I keep thinking about the moment Faye almost said no. She told Elliot that herself, sitting in a diner booth, 2 cold coffees between them, that the case had come to her by accident, a last-minute reassignment, someone else's emergency. She almost declined because her caseload was full, and if she had, Elliot Crane would still be sitting in that room, staring at a garden he never asked for, while the people who were supposed to love him filed the paperwork to take everything he'd built. That's the part that stays with me, how close it came to going the other way. Because here's what I've come to believe, the consequences we live with aren't random. They follow directly from the choices we make when no one's watching and nothing's guaranteed. Faye didn't know what she was walking into when she opened that file. She just knew something didn't sit right, and she decided to keep looking. That decision, made quietly, without applause, in a county office on an ordinary Tuesday, is what changed everything. There's something in that worth sitting with. Doing right by someone when it costs you, nothing is easy. Faye knew that if she pushed, she could be reassigned, discredited, quietly moved aside the way her colleagues had been before her. She knew Stuart Price was watching her. She knew the system doesn't always protect the people who push back against it. She knew all of that, and she drove to a copy shop at midnight anyway, because she couldn't think of anything else to do that she could live with. That's what integrity actually looks like. Not a grand gesture, not a speech, just a person, alone in a parking lot with the engine running, deciding that what's right matters more than what's safe. And then there's what Elliot did. People talk about intelligence like it's about being the smartest person in the room, but what Elliot demonstrated was something sharper and rarer, the discipline to think clearly when everything in him wanted to react. He heard his daughter and son-in-law in that hallway, and his first instinct was to fight back immediately. He stopped himself. He thought it through. He understood that moving too fast would cost him everything, so he did the hardest thing a person in his position could do. He waited. He stayed quiet, and he paid attention, and he built his case from the inside out. That kind of thinking doesn't come from intelligence alone. It comes from the willingness to sit with discomfort long enough to see the whole picture. And then there's Faye again, because she keeps coming back to me, and the particular kind of endurance it takes to keep showing up for someone who cannot show up for themselves, day after day, to a room where she wasn't sure anyone was listening, doing the work precisely because it needed to be done, and not because anyone would know. That's what I want to carry from this story, not the courtroom win, not the foundation or the ring on the mountain or the villain going to prison. All of that is real and it matters, but the part that changes you is smaller and quieter than any of it. It's Faye Calloway walking into room 14 with a coffee-stained notepad, choosing to believe that the person in that chair was worth seeing clearly. And Elliot Crane, alone in the dark, deciding to trust her. Some things only become possible when someone refuses to look away. And sometimes the most important choice you'll ever make is the one that nobody else will ever know you made.